Hey, let's talk about Edgar Allan Poe, creator of detective fiction, lover of his cousin, and past living metaphor for tragedy, who is remembered for changing the literary landscape as we know it today. Even this raven alone can remind some of him, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts to Elizabeth and David Poe. His father abandoned his family and his mother died just a year later. Well, this is why his adopted family, the Allans, gave him his middle name. The Allans were also quite wealthy, and Edgar in return was a bit spoiled growing up. For this same reason, he was able to enroll in 1826 to the University of Virginia to study language. But it may have been Poe's gambling debts that led him to dropping out just a year later, staying a school kid. Leading to this, he returned back to his foster family, and that's where his relationship to them dwindled. He then entered the military afterwards, after being abandoned by his family, and went under the false name Edgar A. Perry, and actually earned the rank of Sergeant Major for artillery, the highest rank in the non-commissioned officer battalions. He still had a love for language though. He later published his first work, Timberline and Other Poems, by the pseudonym of Bostonia. After returning home to his family, he was forced by his stepfather to attend West Point Military Academy if he wanted to stay home with him, which he later dropped out into. He was then disowned, forcing him in 1831 to live with his other family in Baltimore, which is where he met his future spouse. As for Poe's literary career, it was pretty average. He had to deal with several publishing constraints, and although Poe was one of the first in America to make money as a writer, it was barely enough to pay to make a living. He caught a break though when he got a job as a critic for the Richmond newspaper. It was then when his piece, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, was credited for starting the detective fiction genre. He reached the peak of his fame in 1845, when his most famous poem, The Raven, was featured in the Evening Mirror. This was unfortunately short-lived though, due to the realization that it only brought him short change in wealth, and his wife Virginia's case of tuberculosis soon arrived. When she passed, Poe's life entered a downward spiral. Then, in September 27, 1849, he left his home in New York for Philadelphia to take an editing job. He never actually made it to his destination though. Poe was found less than a week later in a ditch in Baltimore, and clothes that weren't even his, and he was delirious out of his mind. And just 4 days later, he died. There are many theories to the cause of his death. The most likely case was that on October 3rd, that being an election day, led Poe to lie in a ditch next to a polling station and commit cooping, which was a form of voting fraud in the US around the 19th century, where victims voted for a number of times in different disguises, where in return they would be rewarded with alcohol. His death was not a shock to anyone though. Even his obituary was mundane, but because it was written by Rufus Griswold, who also published a memoir of Poe as a drunk and an unethical womanizer. In return though, he made Poe far more interesting than he actually hoped for. Poe was more than just a man with a puny mustache, an attraction to birds, and who wasn't Tesla. He was clearly portrayed as a figure that was attested and publicized by some as a passing memory. But in reality, he resembled to the American people as a symbol for contemporary literature.